Hello, Superstar 7th graders. It's Miss Schmidt here, and my kitty, Hermione. She's joining us for class today. And it is Tuesday, May 11th, and today we're going to be talking about the battles of Lexington and Concord. So Tuesday, May 11th, our essential question is still, how was it possible for the American patriots to gain their independence from the powerful British Army? What do you consider to be the most important moment of the war? Our current unit. Big idea is that the tensions between the colonies and Great Britain led to armed conflict starting in 1775. And our objective for today is we are learning to connect how armed conflict between British soldiers and colonists engendered, which just means started or caused, the shot heard round the world. And that's kind of like a catchphrase that talks about the battles of Lexington and Concord, which is what we're talking about today. Those are our standards, and there's our homework. I'll review that again at the end. Here's our do now for today. So if you have not typed this or answered this question in your do now assignment, you should do that at this time. Our do now question is, what was the First Continental Congress? Who was there? What decisions came from this Congress? So think back to those notes that we took together. If you haven't completed those notes yet, make sure you complete them, and then that will help you with this do now. Or look it up, actually. Look up what the First Continental Congress was. You're smart. You can do that. So there we go. That's our do now. So today for class, as we hop into talking about the battles of Lexington and Concord, before we jump into that, I need you to open up two things, or maybe three things. No, two things. So you should have this video open. Okay, bye, kitty. You should have this video opened. You should have your module textbook, either your digital PDF version or your hard copy. And you should have the Lexington and Concord notes from the assignment that you got this video from. So those notes, just as a way of reminder, should look like this. So those are the three things you need. The first one is you need this video, and if you're watching it, you have it, so great job. The second thing that you need is your textbook. And the third thing you need are these notes, this document that says Lexington and Concord. Okay. If you have all those three things ready, we are ready to get started and hop right in. Okay. So what we're going to do today as we talk about the battles of Lexington and Concord, so far we've talked about all the different acts that have led up to the revolution and the tension there. Then we talked about the First Continental Congress, where they started to make decisions about what to do about all of these events that were happening and unfair treatment of Great Britain towards the colonies. And now, if you remember from our notes about the First Continental Congress, they had agreed to meet again in a year after that first Congress happened. But before they even had a chance to do that, violence started to break out. And that's going to be our first two battles of the Revolutionary War, the battles of Lexington and Concord. Okay? So that's what we're talking about today. And we're going to start off, we're going to kind of learn about this material in a few different ways to hopefully really stick it in your brain. So we'll start with watching a little clip, okay? And this should seem familiar. We might have watched some of it in class already. We'll watch a few minutes of it.
April 18th, 1775. British troops are on the march. Colonial militia are arming and stockpiling ammunition for what many fear is an inevitable showdown. British Commander General Thomas Gage has ordered his soldiers to capture a huge hidden store of gunpowder in Concord, a Massachusetts village 20 miles west of Boston.
The British detachment that marches out of Boston, roughly 800 soldiers, march out knowing that the countryside is on the verge of armed action. Once Gage sends that mission out, he really has set into motion a chain of events that is beyond his ability to control.
British are indeed coming.
The news starts leaking out and people start mobilizing. They're ready.
Out into the countryside to spread the word goes Paul Revere, whose engraving of the Boston Massacre fanned the flames of outrage 5 years earlier. Poems and school books will one day mythologize Revere's midnight ride as if he were the lone, heroic messenger. But in fact, he is just one part of a whole system of communication.
Paul Revere is one of dozens, then scores, and literally hundreds of messengers going every which way. Bells are ringing, the shots are being fired. So before dawn, hours before dawn, the whole countryside is mobilized and knows what's happening.
They arrange a signal. One lantern light in Boston's Old North Church if the British are coming by land, and two if by boat. British troops rowed to the Cambridge side of the Charles River and wade through reeds and thick marshland to begin their overnight march to Concord. At around 1 in the morning at Lexington, Massachusetts, farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers gathered to intercept the British at Lexington Green. 130 civilians, some too old, some too young, most with no formal military experience, stand ready to risk it all against the world's most feared army.
These were men who literally felt under attack. And in fact, they were under attack. The British Army were walking out to seize colonial property, and they felt compelled to defend it.
2 a.m. After an hour of waiting, no sign of the British. The night's chill sends many home. Others choose nearby Buckman's Tavern to await another alarm. Most hoping it will never come. 4:30 a.m. Drums announce that the British are on their way.
I'm sure the mood on Lexington Green was extremely tense. The best trained, most professional army in the world is bearing down on them. So even though they were fired up with a great sense of injustice, they were probably nervous. And if they weren't, they should have been.
That's it. Okay. Step back, lads. Step back. Take care. Right. Face.
Both sides eye each other suspiciously, both sides not wanting to take a misstep. All of a sudden, a single shot is fired. Nobody knows who fired the shot. After the war, investigations, nobody ever found out. As soon as that shot was fired, both sides commenced firing at will, and the American Revolution was on.
In less than 2 minutes, 8 militiamen lay dead, 10 wounded.
It really lit up the newspapers everywhere. Blood had been shed, and there was really no looking back after that.
So what we just watched was a little bit of a review or just a description of that first battle, the Battle of Lexington. And as you can see here in our textbook, we're on page 114. Lexington is where that phrase, the shot heard round the world, comes from. And if you recall from the video, that was that shot that the British and the colonists were there and they were ready to fight, but somebody shot the first shot and nobody knows who it was, whether they were on the British side or the colonist side, nobody knows. But that was the very first shot of the Revolutionary War that started it all, basically. So we're going to read a little bit about that shot heard round the world, and then we'll take our notes on Lexington before moving on to the next battle of Concord. And they're all wrapped up together. So I'm on page 114. You can either just read along with me like this, or you can open it up if that's helpful for you. Okay, so the shot heard round the world. The Continental Congress planned to meet again in 1775. Before it could, the situation in the colonies had changed for the worse. And that's the ride of Paul Revere. So the British military leaders in the colonies grew uneasy when local militias seemed to be preparing for action. The governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Gage, learned that a stockpile of weapons was stored in Concord, about 20 miles from Boston. He also heard that colonial leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock were meeting in nearby Lexington. In April 1775, he decided to seize the supplies and arrest the two leaders. Gage thought that he had kept his plan a secret. However, Boston was full of spies for the Patriot cause. They noticed the British were preparing for action and quickly informed the Patriots. Unsure of how the British would strike, Sons of Liberty member Paul Revere enlisted the aid of Robert Newman. Newman was to climb into the steeple of the Old North Church and watch for British soldiers. If they advanced across land, Newman would display one lantern from the steeple. If they rode across the Charles River, Newman would display 2 lanterns. So all of that should be starting to ring a little bit of a bell. We just watched that in the video. Paul Revere is one of the Sons of Liberty, and he is he's the one that, if you've ever heard the phrase like the British are coming, he's like, that's attributed to him, like riding out to the countryside for this, to warn everybody for this first battle that the British were coming. And so let's look at those notes together at this point. I think we've got what we need to start filling out those notes. So follow along with me. Make sure your notes are opened, your Lexington and Concord notes, okay? So we're going to replace the highlighted letters with the correct notes. So on this side, we have General Gage. And if you recall from what we just read, General Gage is the governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Gage. So this is the cause for this Battle of Lexington. Thomas Gage learns that of stolen British ammunition. So we're going to replace letter A with stolen British ammunition and weapons in Concord, Massachusetts. Okay? So he's the governor of Massachusetts. He hears that the Patriots are starting to prepare for war, and they're starting to prepare for war by stealing British ammunition and weapons. So he's like, okay, this is not happening. And he sends out British troops, they send out British troops to go and seize or take back the weapons. So that's what letter C is. Seize. That's just a fancy word for take back or like take control of the weapons, and arrest Hancock and Adams. So John Hancock and Samuel Adams are kind of like the organizers. They're the ones who are like getting all the Patriots rallied together to steal these weapons and prepare for war. And so Thomas Gage here is like, we need to shut this down. He's trying to keep the Patriots from fighting for independence here. So that's his plan. And he thinks that he's doing this sneaky on the down low. But let's flip over to the Bostonians side here, and we see that they actually start to find out about this plan to seize the weapons before General Gage, before the soldiers are able to make it there. So letter D should be replaced with the word spies. Spies were always listening in Boston. So the Patriots had spies planted all throughout Boston to to hear if anything like this was to happen so that they would be prepared to fight. So spies were always listening, and they created a plan just in case the British did come, because they knew what they were doing was illegal. They knew they were stealing these weapons, and they had to be sneaky with it. So they had created this plan so that if the British were to come and try to take it, they would find out about it before they had a chance to. So that plan was that those lanterns that we saw in the video and in our textbook here. Okay, so Gage thought he had kept his plan secret, but Boston was full of spies for the Patriot cause. They noticed the British were preparing for action and quickly informed the Patriots. So since they didn't know how the British would strike, Sons of Liberty member Paul Revere got Robert Newman to climb to the steeple of the Old North Church. And side note, that church is still there in Boston today. I actually visited it several years ago. So if you ever have a chance to go to Boston, it's pretty cool. They have a lot of historical sites here of like Paul Revere's ride and all of that stuff. So Newman was to wait at the steeple, which is just like the top pointy part of this church, and watch for the British soldiers. So he's up there and he's waiting to see how the British are going to come and attack. And they had this like secret code. If the British were going to come by land, Newman would put one lantern. And if the British were going to come across the river by the water, he would put two lanterns out. And that way they would know which way the British were coming, by which direction they were going to be coming, and they could be prepared. So for E, you should put in one lantern if they came by land, two lanterns if they came by sea. Okay? And then for G, that's our guy Paul Revere. So you should replace letter G with Paul Revere, and William Dawes would wait for the signal. So it wasn't just Paul Revere, but he was kind of like the organizer of this. Okay. So that's all leading up to what happens at Lexington. So at this point, no shots have been fired yet. Paul Revere is like rushing out to let all of the militia on the way to. So this is actually like a map of his ride. So here from Boston, William Dawes and Paul Revere go two different routes so that they can let as many people as possible know. If you remember from the video, they were saying like everybody talks about Paul Revere, but eventually he's spreading the word so everybody knows that the British is coming by like morning time. So we've got these two routes. Paul Revere, I believe, is the red route, and then William Dawes is the blue route. So their goal is to let all the people know, and the main goal is to let the people in Concord know, because remember, that's where the British ammunition is hidden or stolen and stockpiled. So they're trying to get there and let them know before the British get there to take it. And so on the way, they're telling all of these militia, and because they tell so many people, we have what happens here, the Battle of Lexington. It's kind of like a way to just like stop the British and slow them down from making it all the way to Concord. So we actually see that here in this red line. That's Paul Revere's ride, and he actually gets captured by the British on his way to trying to warn the people at Concord. However, he's able to pass the message along to Samuel Prescott. That's the green line here. And he is able to warn the people at Concord to hide the rest of the British ammunition. But before we get a chance to even get there, we have the Battle of Lexington, which is where they try to slow the British down and stop them from getting all the way to Concord. And we watched up to that point on the video as well. I think I'm going to read a little bit more of our textbook so we can just get a little more context and remind ourselves who died at that battle. Okay? And that's where the shot heard round the world happens. So listen up for that. So when Revere and fellow patriot William Dawes saw two lights shine, they set off on horseback. So two lights meant that they were coming by sea. So the British were coming by the harbor, or the Charles River, I should say. So using two different routes out of Boston, they sounded the alert. As the riders advanced, drums and church bells called out the local militia, or Minutemen, who got their name because they were ready to fight at a minute's notice. You guys have talked about that before, so you knew what that meant. But many Minutemen were just rural farmers. Others were craftsmen who lived in towns and cities. So these were not trained soldiers. They were just regular guys. And so then we've got the battles at Lexington and Concord. At dawn on April 19th, the British troops arrived at the town of Lexington, which is near Concord, which you could see on the map there, where 70 armed Minutemen waited. Patriot Captain John Parker yelled to his troops, "Don't fire unless fired upon." Suddenly, a shot rang out. To this day, no one knows who fired this shot heard round the world. So the battle at Lexington ended in minutes. Which is kind of crazy to think about, an entire battle only happening in a few minutes, with only a few volleys fired, just only a few shots fired. When the smoke cleared, 8 of the badly outnumbered Minutemen, so that's our patriots, lay dead, and 10 were wounded. The British, with only 1 soldier wounded, marched on to Concord. So that's the Battle of Lexington. We'll pause there. And that doesn't seem like a very encouraging start for our colonists, for our Revolutionary Army, for our patriots. But that's what happened. At the Battle of Lexington, where the shot heard round the world happens, we get 0 British deaths. So nobody on the British soldiers dies. Only 1 of them is wounded. So this is Lexington. So you should type that into your notes. Under Lexington battle results, you should replace the first question mark with 0 deaths and then 1 wounded for British. But for the colonists, we had 8 deaths and 10 wounded. So that's not a lot of people total, but already we can see that kind of looks like a win for the British and a lose for the colonial army. And now, without anything to stop them, they're moving on to Concord. They're trying to get these weapons. And if they get these weapons, then our colonists are really in trouble because already they're not trained soldiers. And if they lose all of the ammunition and the weapons that they've stolen, they have like no way to defend themselves against the British army. And they're basically toast. So they need these weapons. They need the British to not find them. So let's find out what happens, moving on to the Battle of Concord. And before I read any more, we'll actually watch that next section first on that video series we were just watching. So grab some popcorn. We'll watch a few more minutes of that video.
It will take 6 weeks for the news to reach London. By then, the course is set.
I think there's a recognition in London after Lexington that the battle has been joined, that the chances for preventing this conflict from degenerating into war has just about passed.
The conflict calls Benjamin Franklin home from London. After nearly 20 years in England, he is leaving for good, no longer loyal and no longer welcome. Branded a revolutionary traitor by the British, Franklin will set sail for his Philadelphia home to take a seat in the Continental Congress. A man of peace, he will now have to counsel war as he helps his fellow delegates navigate the new and bloody conflict that threatens to blow America apart. April 19th, 1775, Lexington, Massachusetts. For the first time ever, British soldiers and colonial citizens have stood face to face and fired upon each other. 8 colonists lay dead. But it's not over. British continue their advance to get what they came for, the colonial ammunition stored in nearby Concord. Along the way, detachments of redcoats storm into local homes and ransack for weapons. The word spreads, and militia from all over the area rush toward Concord to head off the British. This time, it's the Americans who are coming.
They find not just the Concord militiamen, but all sorts of other militiamen coming and still coming and still coming and still coming.
The British are certain they can swat these militia away like pesky flies, and find that they cannot, that they have encountered hard-fighting men.
The British are badly outnumbered. They are forced to retreat. 16 miles separate them from the safety of Boston. 16 miles. On foot. They are sitting ducks for armed and angry colonials. It is a trauma they won't soon forget.
All the hills on either side of us were covered with rebels, so that they kept the road always lined and a very hot fire on us, without intermission. Henry de Bernier, British soldier.
"20 hours of constant barrage bring heavy losses to the beleaguered British. 73 dead, 174 wounded, and 26 missing. The Americans suffer 49 killed, with 40 wounded and 5 missing. By the time British soldiers get back to Boston, the colonials have the city surrounded. 40 wounded and 5 missing. By the time British soldiers get back to Boston, the colonials have the city surrounded, with militia from neighboring colonies on their way. Gage and his troops are trapped, with their backs to the sea.
The rebels have added insult to outrage. They have possessed the roads and other communications by which the town of Boston was supplied with provisions, and with a preposterous parade of military arrangement, they have effected to hold the army besieged. Thomas Gage.
Okay, so that video helped us move on to the Battle of Concord. Okay, so we had just gone over the battle at Lexington, where things didn't look so good for the colonists, but then from what we just watched, it seems like we get a little bit of a turnaround by the time they actually make it all the way to Concord. So if you're thinking about that map where Paul Revere rode out to warn the people in Concord, we have Lexington, and it's that's the first battle where the colonists basically lost within minutes, and then they kept going all the way to Concord. And let's read a little bit of our textbook to help give us a little bit more context before we try to tackle those notes for the Battle of Concord. All right, so I'm on page 115 and taking it from right about here, although Revere. So although Revere had been arrested, the citizens of Concord were warned by another rider, Samuel Prescott. Most of the weapons in Concord had already been hidden, but the few that were left were now concealed. Some of the British troops, frustrated because the stockpile had disappeared, set fire to a few buildings. In reaction, the Minutemen charged forward. For the skilled colonial marksmen of Concord, the British soldiers made an easy target. They were wearing the British military uniform with its bright red jacket. For some time, the colonists had called the British soldiers redcoats because of these jackets. The British were forced to retreat to Boston, suffering many casualties on the way. Okay, so that's our battle at Concord. So we see that after Lexington, where the British marched on to Concord, even though Lexington didn't go so well for the colonists, they had bought themselves enough time to hide those weapons and ammunition in Concord and to get more militia from nearby towns to all come together at Concord. So it wasn't just the Concord Patriot militia who were there, those colonists. It was other militia from nearby towns that all came together. So then at that point, the British were outnumbered, and the colonists were ready for them. So we heard a little bit of it in that video, but when we think about the Concord battle results, I'm going to give you some specific numbers, but there is a little bit, if you look them up, there's like usually like a difference of like 1 or 2 or 3. But overall, the British deaths, we have, let me actually go to the notes so I can be reminded of them. So the Battle of Concord, in British, we have 73 deaths and 174 wounded. And for colonists, we only have 49 deaths and 40 wounded. So our colonists do a little bit better this time around than they did at Lexington. But you should type in those notes there. So for British, at Concord, we have 73 deaths and 174 wounded. And then for the colonists, we have 49 deaths and 40 wounded. So you should replace those notes there. 49 deaths, 40 wounded. Okay? But what specifically happened at Concord that we saw in the video and read in our textbook just then is that the British, the colonists had hidden those supplies, so the British couldn't find it. The British basically threw a temper tantrum at this point because they didn't find what they were looking for, so they started to burn random things, which just made the colonists more angry, and that made them attack the British at Concord. So the colonists attack the British at Concord, and in the meantime, militias begin to arrive from other villages, like I was just talking about. So not just the Concord militia, but other ones nearby. And this causes, this turns into not just defending and hiding these ammunition, it turns into a full-on, they go from the defense to the offense here. And the colonists like push out the British soldiers. This turns into like a real battle, and they are forced to retreat back to Boston. So that's our last note. You should replace J with the word Boston. And so that's the battles of Lexington and Concord. That's our first 2 major battles of the Revolutionary War. And we'll find when we meet back together for our next class that at this point, the colonists come together for the Second Continental Congress. So we had talked about the First Continental Congress. They planned to meet again, and we have these 2 battles in between. And so now they have a lot to talk about at that Second Continental Congress, and we will learn about what they do end up talking about next time. So make sure you type in these notes and turn them in our Teams page so that you can earn credit for your work.